exploitation of danger without the confirmation of us, of us. There's no confirmation of us. Okay. Hi, I'm Kayla Amanda. Welcome back to my channel. Thank you so much for being here. And today I wanted to do something a little bit different than I usually do. I want to try looking really closely at a scene that I think works really well and examine kind of why it succeeds. So apologies if, like me, you have some traumatic flashbacks to doing close reading assignments in college classes. Obviously, I read a lot of paranormal, specifically paranormal romance, and these stories tend to lean into tropes where you have these powerful paranormals who are usually men, and their interest in their object of affection is presented as in of itself dangerous to that lover. No shade, I totally enjoy those tropes to varying degrees of how dangerous actually is this. But the scene that I want to look at is in Magic Stars by Ilona Andrews, and I think it does a really good job of establishing the dangerous attraction of a dangerous man while still feeling safe for a heroine. It walks that line between sexy danger and real risk while still feeling comfortable for the object of his affection. So let's set the stage. Magic Stars is an interquel novella in the Kate Daniels series by Ilona Andrews. It's book 8.5-ish. And while it doesn't really have any impact on the larger plot, it does some character work for Derek and Julie. If you have read the main series but you haven't picked up the interquel books, all you need to know is that Derek and Julie are on the same MacGuffin hunt and they've just duked it out with the mid-boss. If you have not yet read the series, the only additional information that you need to know is that Derek is a little bit older than Julie. They've known each other for a number of years now and he's pretty protective of her. Julie is a former street kid who does magic, and Derek is a badass werewolf who, for traumatic backstory reasons, is a little more feral than his friends. His extra feralness is called the Wild. As we open our scene, Julie has just held off the mid-boss with some magic while Derek healed from some silver poisoning for long enough to get back into the game. And he gets back into the game in a seriously violent and bloody way. He has just killed everything there is to kill, except for Julie, sitting in a magic circle. Hello, welcome to Editing, Kayla. I just wanted to cover two things that came up while I was working on this video before we get any farther. The first is that I do discuss sexuality and violence and sort of the crossroad between sexuality and violence. Use the word horny a bunch. If that's gonna bother you, maybe skip this video. It's not at all explicit, but it is there. And the other one is that I could not find a way to break up the text I want to look at into smaller sections without making it seem sort of stilted and unnatural. So I am going to give you like more than a minute of audiobook and ebook text. All of the rights belong to their copyright holders. This is 100% just for commentary and positive commentary. So like, no snitching, okay?
There had to be something left to kill. There was still one heart beating. He turned and saw her sitting in a circle. She looked good. He walked to the circle. She didn't move. She just watched him with pretty brown eyes. He ran headfirst into a wall. He couldn't see it, but it was there. He looked down and noticed a white chalk line between him and her. Magic. He circled the ward, probing it with his claws. The invisible wall held all the way around. He stopped in front of her and crouched so they were level. His voice was an inhuman, ragged snarl. "Let me in." "I don't think that would be a good idea." "Let me in." "Maybe in a little while," she said, "once you cool off." "I'm all cooled off." He wanted into that circle. "In a little bit." He backed away and ran full speed at the circle. The wall held. "You really can't skip the hunt," she told him. It took another 4 tries before he decided he couldn't break through the wall. He kicked the corpses for a while, but they didn't put up a fight, and the horse had run off. He thought of tracking it down, but he would have to leave her, and he didn't want to. He finally settled for stretching out by the circle and looking at the moon. It soothed him until his breath evened out. Slowly, the rational thought returned.
Ilona Andrews do 4 things here that make it really work for me as a shipper and make me want to be able to replicate it in my own writing. Thing the first is, so they were level. Derek does this thing once he circles the magical and realizes that it's completely solid all the way around. He crouches down and gets on her level. We're in his point of view, so that's the language he chooses to use. I mean, having your hunky dangerous alpha guy loom over his love interest is pretty standard paranormal romance fare. And in his warrior form, Derek is 7 feet tall. He could do a pretty intimidating loom over a teenage girl who's sitting cross-legged on the floor. He He doesn't use all of that supernatural height and partial half animal nudity, because paranormals are weird, to intimidate her. He says, "Let me in." It's not a question, it's a command. There is no please, there is no question mark. He's telling her what to do. But he doesn't say open that circle. He doesn't say I'm getting in whether you like it or not. He doesn't say I'm gonna huff and puff and blow your house down. He says, "Let me in." It's language that specifically allows her to be in control of who has access to her. She has to make the choice to allow him in. He might be blood-crazed alpha werewolf guy, but his language still gives her the agency to let him in or not. While we're talking about giving Julie agency, let's actually talk about Julie herself, which is thing number 2. I love Julie. I love Julie and Derek, and I am very excited for her spin-off series, the first book of which will be out by the time this goes live, and I definitely have it pre-ordered. As the perhaps in danger object of his affection, and because I think that the scene does a really good job of having exciting, dangerous attraction while also making me feel like Julie is at no real risk, I think how the scene frames Julie is actually really important to look at. And to be quite honest, she's pretty blasé about the whole thing. Later on, she'll tell Derek that nothing he does scares her, and relief will wash through him because that werewolf is a smitten kitten. But this scene tells us that she's not bluffing when she says that. She's not afraid of him. There's a healthy dose of caution for sure, but not fear. Remember, Derek is blood-soaked and crazed. He's just killed everything there is to kill, and he's looking for something else. The line that brings him back to Julie is,
There had to be something left to kill. There was still one heart beating.
but as he walks towards her, she just watches him with her pretty brown eyes. When he runs full speed at the magic circle trying to break his way through to her, all she says is, "You really shouldn't skip the hunt." It's chiding and almost flippant. This 7-foot-tall warrior smashes his dumb werewolf body against that circle 5 times. And all she does is tell him that she'll let him in when he's cooled off a little. Not if, when. And cools off is a choice too, right? Like, that's pretty mild language given everything that's going on around her. Not calms down, not gets himself under control, just chills out. She doesn't drop her circle, she holds firm to that precaution. Like the audience, she can see the implication of violence and the risk he might pose to her, but that does seem more like a precaution than a necessity. She just gently rebuffs him and kind of chides him for not taking the edge off his wild, and then she waits him out. Let's revisit the big bad wolf himself. Number 3, the tone of his fascination with her. Derek wants into that circle with a quickness. He flat out tells us that, and then he bashes his body into it 5 times. His voice is a ragged, inhuman snarl when he asks to be let in. But we don't actually know what he wants to do with Julie once he gets in. We know he's fascinated, and we know he's driven to getting his hands on her. But we don't know what the nature of that attraction or fascination is. We know he's just killed, and he talked a lot about wanting to taste delicious hot blood in the previous scene. He doesn't do that to Julie, though. Julie, there's nothing about what it is he actually intends for her, which serves this purpose of giving us the implication of danger without the confirmation of it. Yeah, he might want to hurt her, and we don't know either way. But in not knowing, we maintain the sexy possibility of danger without the bummer reality of it. The suggestion of his actual risk to her is further undercut when his response to not getting in is not to continue to berate her, to threaten her, do any of that. He just lies down next to the circle and stares up at the moon. I guess in case you forgot he was a werewolf. He does think about going off to find the horse and kill it, but he doesn't want to leave her. And that is the language he uses. We are in Derek's point of view, and Derek thinks he does not want to leave her, which is not the language of a predator who doesn't want their prey to escape. It also mirrors earlier language in which Derek fights off a magic compulsion by remembering that if he runs, Julie can't keep up with him. He'd have to leave her behind, and his unwillingness to do so is enough to fight off the spell. Similarly, Julie is offered a choice between her life and Derek's, and she chooses Derek because these two will not leave each other alone. Abandoning each other is not on the table for them. So even at his most irrational, in the hold of his wild, Derek chooses to stay with her and chooses to use language that is, if not explicitly protective, then at least non-violent. The final thing is the language of his attraction to her. So we know that Derek is fascinated with her and he wants to get his hands on her, and we're not totally sure if that's for horny or homicidal reasons. After all, what brings his attention back to her is the sound of her heart when he's looking for something else to kill. But despite that, he only says 2 things about her looks. One, that she looks ellipses, italics, good, and 2, that she has pretty brown eyes. Ellipses, italics, good is an inherently horny phrasing, which is supported by the way the narrator does the audiobook.
She looked good.
But instead of following it with a description of her tits or her lips or her legs or her delicate throat or whatever sexualized part of her anatomy, he tells us she has pretty brown eyes. Romance novels have a lot of eye description in it because the eyes are the windows to the soul, and it's a good shorthand for intimacy. It talks a lot about prolonged intimate eye contact. So we establish that he is a dangerous man by having his homicidal tendency be what brings his attention back to her. And then we link his dangerous nature to his attraction to her with his immediate and overtly sexualized appraisal of her. But then we undercut that by having his interest be specifically non-sexual, her pretty eyes, which brings up intimacy and not horniness. The description of her eyes as pretty brown eyes also ducks the fetishized infantilization of young women that we get with like wide-eyed innocence or whatever. It's just sort of a sweet thing to note about your partner, not an inherently sexy one. So what's the point? This little section is only 253 words, which is about 1 page of a paperback, which is not actually a lot of time to do much of anything. But this little scene fragment manages to tell us a lot about the relationship between Julie and Derek and the nature of that attraction. We know that he's a dangerous man, and we know that his dangerous nature can feed directly into his attraction to Julie. But despite that, at his most irrational and his most dangerous, Julie's not afraid of him. She has a healthy dose of concern, and she's cautious, but she's also casual with him and gently rebuffs him instead of being afraid of him. As a reader, I can feel comfortable that she's safe with him because even at his most feral and irrational, the language he uses when he thinks about her and talks to her is more protective than predatory, it is more intimate than sexual, and it puts agency to allow him physical access to her body into her hands. Julie isn't afraid of his physicality or his attempts to break into her circle, and as a reader, I don't think she's being stupid for that, because when he does have the opportunity to use his physical size to intimidate or bully her, he chooses not to and instead puts himself on her level and gives himself more equal footing with her. So yeah, that's why I think the scene does such a good job of establishing Derek as a sexy, dangerous bad boy, but never worrying that Julie is gonna wake up dead because of it. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. If you enjoyed this, go ahead and click the like button and subscribe. I'm trying to post every Monday. If you totally hated this and think I'm out to lunch, feel free to leave any comments, questions, concerns below. If you're looking for me anywhere else, I am Kayla Amanda, pretty much everywhere. That is Kaylughmanda, and I will see you next time.